Good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you all, and thank you very much for including me in this conversation. Thank you, DSPA, for including me in your community. So this is a really interesting time for technology, right? So for those that believe that technology is there to solve meaningful problems, I think this is a really good test as to how we can do that safely and ethically. So COVID-19 is first and foremost a health crisis. Technology is only there to support the solutions, but since it's a health crisis, our primary focus has got to be in making sure that we have enough people tested. Now, countries around the world have had different levels of difficulty in getting enough testing kits for the population. So in reality, the technology doesn't work unless you've got the data as to whether someone has COVID-19 or not. Then there's the privacy issues, of course. We are in a potential, we have to make sure that we don't put data into a potentially precarious situation where we could have surveillance, mass surveillance. And so on this front, it's really, it's phenomenal to see companies like Apple and Google taking the lead in creating guidelines and stipulating that their recommendations are for the data to be decentralized. And it's interesting how different European countries have adopted different strategies. So Germany was originally going to have centralized data, but they just changed their direction, and now they're following Apple's and Google's recommendations, and they're going decentralized. The UK is still doing centralized so far. They're still testing their app in the Isle of Wight, but Scotland, for instance, has already pushed back. So we'll see what happens there. I think a big issue there as well is around trust. Without trust, we're not going to have uptake. And it's important that there's coordination across countries. And the reason for that is other than COVID-19 actually does travel between countries, if we want to have full lockdown lift and we want to be able to travel between one country and the next, if different countries deploy different technologies and different ways of tracking, well then in reality, anyone who travels from country A to country B is going to have both apps running. Now, the danger with this is if, for instance, it drains batteries, it's more likely to annoy people and then they switch off. And so then there's no impact. And realistically, pragmatically, anyone who's using the apps, if they go to another country, they will still have to carry on using the app for at least 2 weeks after they have left that country. Then, of course, for the apps to be effective, 60% of the population need to download it. And that's, and then you've got to figure, we've got to factor in, does the app work on low-tech phones? Because we've got to factor smartphone penetration versus low-tech phones, and those, of course, that don't have phones. So the 60% of the population becomes a bigger number. Then you look at countries, for instance, such as Australia. There's been a very low uptake so far, but they've had very few cases. So factors that could impact the potential uptake, we've mentioned smartphone penetration, but then there's, of course, this trust in the government and their strategy. And then there's if people feel that they need it. Some may not want to break self-isolation and hence will not need to use the app. And then there's the question of kids and minors. And our kids and minors don't tend to have smartphones. So what are we going to do there? And then we need to be aware of essential workers. They are the ones most likely going to use the app because they're the ones that are in the most vulnerable positions job-wise as well. And we want to make sure that we don't create a tier system where the more vulnerable members of our communities and societies are having more data tracked around them than other potentially more well-off people. So I think the stratification of society is something we need to be aware of. But again, I stress this is a health crisis, and so our primary focus must be on making sure that we have enough supplies and enough equipment going to our health workers, and making sure we have enough testing kits in the first place to understand who has it and who doesn't, and of course for those tests to work. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any particular questions, you can send me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn. Look, it's a very dynamic situation. It's changing all the time. So let's see what happens and what transpires. But I think the more vocal and more proactive we all are in keeping tabs on the situation and making sure that we not only safeguard our health, but we also safeguard our future, not just for the many, but not just for the few, but for everyone. Stay safe, and I hope to see you soon. God bless.